Welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Welcome to the University of Colorado at Denver. My name is Stephen Vos. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at CU Denver, and I hold the Bhagwan Suparshvanatha Endowed Chair in Jain Studies. We can talk about that later. On behalf of my co-organizer, Dr. Kay Moorman, associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies, we are thrilled to bring you an important and timely discussion with two world-class scholars on a vitally important topic, right behind me, white Christian nationalism and the future of U.S. politics. Before I introduce our speakers and our moderator for this evening, I want to thank our sponsors for this event. This was truly a collaboration, including across two campuses in the University of Colorado system, namely with the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And its director, Dr. Jeffrey Scholes, is here tonight. Thank you, Jeff. I must also thank Drs. Deepa Sundaram and Andrea Stanton of the University of Denver, and co-organizers of the Rocky Mountain Great Plains Regional Meeting of the American Academy of Religion and Religion and Bible Society of the Rocky Mountain Great Plains region. Imagine putting that on a program. Thank you especially for adjusting the schedule to accommodate this event tonight. Here at CU Denver, we also have many helping hands to thank, including the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Campus Access and Engagement, Dr. Antonio Farias, who supported us with an Inclusive Excellence Grant and additional funding. We are also supported by the Office of Graduate Education and the Assistant Vice Chancellor, Dr. Michael Kosett, and the Dean's Office of CU Denver's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and its Program for Strategic Initiatives and Community Relationships, led by Associate Dean Dr. Marjorie Levine Clark. We also have several departments to thank, especially the Department of History, as well as Interdisciplinary Studies, which includes the Program in Religious Studies and the Master of Humanities and Social Sciences programs. This evening's panel is also supported by the Departments of Sociology, Integrated Studies, Political Science, Philosophy, and Communication, as well as Ethnic Studies. And I must especially thank their student worker, Christine Galvez, for her help with flyers and with getting the word out around campus and on social media. We have left flyers and information about several of our departments and programs by the door, and I encourage you all to learn more about what we have to offer here at CU Denver, and particularly in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for as we say, you can't spell class without CLAS. I also want to acknowledge promotional support from CU Denver's School for Public Affairs, which is the only spa in Denver that does not offer warm towels. I'd also like to thank the Auraria Campus Police Department for providing security tonight. No jokes there. Most of all, we'd like to extend a big thank you to Angela Beal, our program assistant for interdisciplinary studies, who handled all of the details that made this event possible. A round of applause for her and our student workers. Now, before I introduce our speakers for the evening, a little bit of housekeeping. This panel discussion will go for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. This event is being recorded and will be made available on the YouTube channels of the UCCS Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, as well as the Religious Studies and other departmental channels here at CU Denver. For that reason, we will have two microphones, like this one, that we will circulate around the room. I will be handling one. I'll have an assistant do another. But we just ask that you please wait until you get the microphone before you start your question. And now to the main event. Our panelists this evening are distinguished scholars, known to many who work in the field of American religions, or who just live and pay attention to the news here in this country. First, we have Dr. Anthea Butler, Geraldine R. Siegel Professor in American Social Thought and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, go Quakers. A historian of African American and American religion, Professor Butler's research and writing spans African American religion and history, race, politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. She is the winner of the 2022 Martin Marty Award for Public Understanding of Religion from the American Academy of Religion. And you'll figure out why I emphasize that in a second. She is currently co-director of the Crossroads Project for Black Religious Histories, Communities, and Cultures, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. Professor Butler has also been honored with honorary doctorates from the Lutheran Theological Seminary and Meadville Lombard Theological School. A contributor to the 1619 Project's book with the chapter Church, she is the author of 2 books, Women in the Church of God in Christ, and her most recent, 2021's White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, which you can see right here. Both published by the University of North Carolina Press. She is also a regular opinion columnist for MSNBC, and you can find some of her recent op-eds on their website. Please welcome Dr. Anthea Butler. Our second panelist tonight is Dr. Randall Balmer, the John Phillips Professor of Religion at Dartmouth College. He is also an ordained Episcopal priest, a historian also. His research and writing focus on religion in North America from the colonial period to the present, with work on evangelicalism in various aspects of American cultural life, including in politics and recently sports. He is the 2024 winner of the Martin Marty Award for Public Understanding of Religion in the American Academy of Religion. What do you know? He also holds honorary doctorates from both the University of the South and Eastern University, North and West to follow, no doubt. He is the author of over 20 books, and that's not counting edited volumes or encyclopedias. The most recent coming last year, an updated edition of 2014's Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. And he is also the author of Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right on Eerdmans, which was actually only the second book he published that year, the other being Solemn Reverence, The Separation of Church and State in American Life on Steerforth. Not slowing down, he is currently authoring 3 books, including a biography of Mark O. Hatfield, the Republican senator from Oregon. His commentaries appear on CNN and in newspapers around the country. Please welcome Dr. Randall Balmer. Our moderator tonight is our own Dr. Kay Moorman, an associate teaching professor in ethnic studies, women and gender studies, and religious studies here at CU Denver. Dr. Moorman's work examines sexuality, race, religion, gender, and nation in the context of U.S. popular and political culture. Her work has appeared in American Quarterly and Radical History Review, among other venues. Her book, Exceptionally Queer, Mormon Peculiarity, and U.S. Nationalism on University of Minnesota Press came out in 2022 and won the Mormon History Association's Best Book Award the following year. She is currently working on another book, tentatively titled Streaming New Racial Capitalism, Secularism, and the Latest Mormon Media Moment. Let me now hand it over to Dr. Moorman.
All right, testing first. Can you hear me well enough? I did not wear the best shirt for this mic. I'd like to say welcome once again to Dr. Butler and Dr. Balmer. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I would love to just dive in with a question that will kind of situate us in the current moment and get us talking about what is white Christian nationalism. All right, so I'm going to start off by naming a constellation of actions that the second Trump administration has taken in the first months in office, all of which are detailed in the Project 2025 playbook. These include dismantling federal agencies, and this has happened in large part through the establishment of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, dismantling DEI efforts by paradoxically framing them as unconstitutionally discriminatory, declaring a commitment to binary understandings of sex and gender by the federal government, while attacking LGBTQ folks, especially transgender and non-binary people, as threats to women and children, reinforcing federal opposition to abortion, ramping up xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and anti-refugee rhetoric, while engaging in increasingly extreme detention and deportation practices, and finally, establishing the White House Faith Office and designating Pastor Paula White Cain, who's a proponent of prosperity theology, as its head, also alongside a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. And that task force alleges in executive orders that there is a need to, quote, end the anti-Christian weaponization of government and an egregious pattern of targeting peaceful Christians while ignoring violent anti-Christian offenses, unquote. So some of these examples are more obvious than others, and there are, of course, other examples. But there's some concrete indicators of how white Christian nationalism is manifesting in this post-election context. So to start us off, I'm wondering if you could both speak to what exactly white Christian nationalism is and how you see the examples that I've just listed as illustrations of that manifestation of white Christian nationalism in this context.
I knew you were going to look at me. Well, this is interesting because when asked to do this description, and I got to put a little background to this and tell you why the descriptor is like this. Was working with one of the Baptist organizations, and we did a whole book after January 6, 2021 about this. And so they asked me to write the section on white Christian nationalism. And I had to think about it for a while because I was like, there's Christian nationalism, there's white Christian nationalism. What is the difference between the two? And so I'm going to give you my generic version, and then I want to talk about it in light of what this is. And my generic version is that you believe that the founders and framers made this country for Christianity, that white men were superior to everybody else, that there was a divine right for them to do what they did, whether that was about moving out Native Americans or enslaving African Americans and anything else. And that basically this was about this nation was for Christians, and that the word Christian is synonymous with white. And I talk about this in my book. But I think the better way to do it is what I said in my book. It's the promise of whiteness. And what I mean by that is this promise that if you will just do this particular way of behaving and acting and being, and it's racialized and non-racialized in some ways, that you will be able to fit in what is America, what is this part of America, and that everybody else is out of that book, out of that description. And so all of these things, if you listen to the whole litany of everything that you just read, Katie, all of this is about race underneath it. And it's racialized in certain kinds of ways. So, you can obviously see DEI, but you might not think about abortion being that way. Well, there's very big fear about birth rates. There's a very big fear about people who don't, do their sexuality in the same way that this is a man and a woman. And that's where the Christian part comes in. And so one of the things I think that's been very important for me to point out to people is that this has been swirling all around America for a very long time. It may have not been called Christian nationalism before or white Christian nationalism. It was called Americanism, in the 40s and 50s and 60s when you have to look at people talking about, communism and things. Or you could think about it as, American exceptionalism, and that got talked a lot about in certain elections in the 2021, if we think about Palin and other people. And then we got to MAGA, Make America Great Again. Make America Great Again is not new, it's old. And so I think that when you hear these phrases, you have to also think about the racial component and why people are trying to run away from the history of what has happened in this country. Because if you want to make a valorous history, if you want to do what Donald Trump said last night is, I'm going to take these museums and fix them and make sure that they have the right kind of a history, that America is so great and everything, then you have to imagine that why do you want to do that to history if there are things in history that you don't want to fix?
Yeah, let me attack it,
Go for it.
bracketing the race issue
Yeah.
for a moment. And nothing you said I disagree with. But as I was thinking about it, it seems to me that Christian nationalism, to be a Christian nationalist, you have to believe two out of the following three things, or at least two. First, the United States was formed as a Christian nation. Second, the United States somehow has become a Christian nation, even if it wasn't formed as a Christian nation. And third, the United States should be, in the future, a Christian nation. So if you believe two out of those three, you probably, I think, are a Christian nationalist. And I think probably the most common one was this notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that it should remain into the future as a Christian nation. Well, what does that look like? Anthony had talked about several things. I certainly agree with that. But I think there's a spectrum among Christian nationalists themselves about what they want or what they envision for a Christian nation. And it encompasses everything from outlawing divorce, certainly outlawing abortion is part of that. And then you get in the more radical group, the so-called Reconstructionists or the theonomists, and they want to recast American civil and criminal law according to their reading of the Bible, particularly Leviticus. They love Leviticus for some reason. They're drawn to that. I often say in my three-part definition of what is an evangelical, the first one is evangelical is somebody who believes that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity. It's so important that they want to interpret it literally, but they engage, I think, in what I call the ruse of selective literalism as they approach the Bible. So Leviticus is kind of their touchstone for how they do that. That would be the more radical part of it. So anything from, and that indeed is radical. That would call for capital punishment, for example, for homosexuality, for even juvenile delinquency, and according to some of these reconstructions. So that would be the spectrum, I think.
Add one thing to this, because I just think that it was really good to say what the person I think described Christian nationalism the best was General Michael Flynn. And when he said, this is a Christian nation and that America should be a Christian nation, it always should be a Christian nation, just what you said. But he said, and that, and America was in the Bible. That was the one that got me.
Right.
Because I was like, wait a minute. I went to seminary. I didn't see America in the Bible. But okay, maybe you got a different Bible. He's got the Trump Bible, right? But it really is something, because they articulated, someone like General Michael Flynn really articulated that in such a way, and it's such an uproar. It was about 2 or 3 years ago that this happened, I think. And it was such an uproar about it, but I thought, there's the definition. You could take it out of the racialized definition. And there's tons of people who believe this across every ethnic group. And I think what you said is very important, because we got to understand that while this has some racial components, everybody sort of buys into this in one way or another. When you say God bless America, or you look, there's a flag in a church or something like that, there's an element of that Christian nationalism there. It's just, where are you on the spectrum?
I'll give you another example of this.
Yeah.
When Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was Trump's press secretary in his first term, ran for governor of Arkansas, one of her slogans was, protect America's God-given Second Amendment rights. Well, somehow I missed that in the book of Genesis, that apparently Adam and Eve were armed. Who knew?
I think you started off with a really great foundation for defining and understanding white Christian nationalism. I'm wondering if you come back to the first part of that question and think about how have some of the things that have been put into practice or put into place in the first couple of months of the Trump administration, how do you see those as expressions or reflections or manifestations of white Christian nationalism?
Well, a big part of it has been protecting Christians, and this I think goes to the whole. I think one of the keys to Trump's appeal to evangelicals. I mean, and this came up in 2016 when, of course, 81% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump, the family values candidate. And I was trying to figure out why that was, and I came up with a 3-part reason. But I think one of the main reasons is that Donald Trump speaks the language of victimization better than anyone I've ever heard. Now, it's always about him. He's the victim, of course. But evangelicals like to see themselves as victims. At least going back to the Scopes trial, probably even longer than that. They see themselves as marginalized. They see themselves as somehow besieged by this broader alien culture. And so one of the reasons they connected, I think, almost, I hesitate to use the word spiritually, but can't think of a better one right now, with Trump, was because he was speaking that language of victimization. Now, he occasionally would say, you guys are the victims too, just like I am. But I mean, I think the real connection was that vocabulary. He understands that language, I think, better than any politician I've seen in my lifetime.
It really does. And that you're so right about the persecution complex, but also grievance.
Yeah.
The grievance is there too. I think one of the things that really sticks out to me about the litany of things that you read, plus the other 100,000 that are still there, right, is about where all these things came from, and all of them have historical antecedents, right? And when we think about the religious right, and where we talk about the 70s and the 80s and all of this, and one of my friends, when we were talking about Project 2025, where a lot of this is codified, right? And people were talking about this before the election, and now you barely hear it because there's so much coming at you from Project 2025, is that she showed a copy of the Heritage Foundation's book from 1980. She had it. And I was like, are you kidding? And, we were going through it. Some of the same stuff that's there. It's the same thing. It's been the same playbook. And I think one of the things that's so frustrating to me as a historian who looks at this history is that this has all been there up front about how they wanted to change education and all this. You brought up Scopes trial. It's the 70s with all the education and, charter schools and all these different things that have popped up because of this. And I think, yeah, this project was always there to tear down government. They told you limited government. And now this is limited government. And everybody is surprised about this because they voted for cheap eggs. And they didn't realize they voted for cheap eggs.
Oh, cheap.
And cheap eggs are going to be so expensive along with cars and everything else. And I think that's the point of all of this is that, Christian nationalism, as I've said before, is causing a lot of the things that you see now, but you just don't recognize it like that because it's coming at you like a fire hose.
One of the reasons I chose to give examples from the first couple of months was not just because we're all experiencing it right now, but because if you read the Project 2025 manual, it's literally all listed in there. So it feels like a fire hose. It feels random. It feels extreme, but it's part of a very clear plan.
And this is a huge difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. I mean, we got through the first Trump administration because of incompetence, essentially, it seems to me. Now they know how to do it. And he's got people in place who know how to do it. And that's what's frightening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the difference is, and you said it right, and I also think that the difference is the first time he had people who could hold the guardrails. The guardrails were gone.
Right.
And I want everybody to understand this.
Especially with the Supreme Court.
The guardrails are gone.
Yeah. And
you should not expect that all this litigation that's happening is going to stop anything. Because it's going to be, this is his game. Let's tie it up in the courts. And he's got, lots of good lawyers and everything else working for him. And I'm just, the whole firm just blanked on me that works with them.
Paul Weiss.
Yeah, Paul Weiss. But basically it's going to be lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. But the Supreme Court just said, oh,
do what you want.
We've already hit on some aspects of other questions I had, but one of the things I wanted to follow up on is I think it's important to discuss explicitly what are the dangers of white Christian nationalism. We're alluding to it, obviously. I can hear it in what y'all are saying and the audience kind of responding to us. But if we think about what kind of political project is the ideology and its proponents, what is it selling? What's it hoping to put in place? We could also think about for the white Christian nationalist figures, groups, and organizations that are currently at play. So just kind of putting some more concrete language on what is the danger, who is actively involved in this.
Let's start with the woman that you brought up, Paula White, who I love to bring up because, I knew her as a prosperity gospel person. And this was very interesting. She lived actually in Donald Trump's penthouse a long time ago. So people don't really realize that they've had a long-term relationship in terms of knowing each other. He actually appeared on one of her talk shows back in the early 2000s. I think this whole thing about having a faith-based office, it's not like other presidents didn't do something similar. What this is now is going to be weaponized. And what it is going to be weaponized to do is to talk about who's a real Christian and who's not. Because I think that's actually the important key here is that they are setting up a certain kind of Christianity. And a Christianity, to me, that is, foundational to prosperity gospel, that is foundational to something that we don't talk about very much anymore, but was very big in the 90s when Stormfront crashed. When the people were able to get after Stormfront and stop them. in Idaho, we don't talk about, that kind of nationalism that was a different kind of white nationalist kind of belief. We don't talk about that anymore. But when you have Elon Musk throwing up a Heil Hitler sign and all this other stuff, then you have to start to think about how that is mixing in with Christianity. Okay. And I'm going to forget the name of the priest that threw up this Heil Hitler, and he was immediately defrocked. That happened. But for Protestants, not so much. Nobody's doing that with them. So I think, not to get off track, but to come back to something basic, is to really think about the ways in which American Christianity under this regime, and I'm going to call it that, is changing, and what that has changed and what that means. And so even when we say the word Christianity, we can't just say Christianity anymore. We have to say Christianities, because there are different kinds of Christianity that are in operation right now. And so while you may have Catholic bishops down, Bishop Seitz and others down at the border in El Paso who are like, we need to march and protect, immigrants. You've got other ones like Bishop Barron who are holding up, the Blessed Sacrament at Mar-a-Lago. And I don't want this to just be like a Protestant thing. There's Catholics in this too. And I really want more people to talk about this, because the Catholic integrationalism that is happening, the ways in which they see the world, this is not simply just an evangelical project. The evangelical and Catholic projects have merged politically, and they merged over abortion. And then they have found all this other thing to be involved with, that they can find like-mindedness. And so, you have to think about the chair of the Heritage Foundation is a Catholic. And so I think this is where we have to start thinking about this in a broader way, and not just simply looking at it as this is merely a Protestant thing, but to talk about how these Christianities are merging together to make a certain kind of superpowered nationalism.
As a scholar of Mormonism, I totally agree, since the Mormons are really in there, but often get left out.
Yes, yeah. They're in there.
Oh, yeah. The other thing I'm personally very interested in, but I think a lot of people are coming to realize is really critical, is the way that sex, gender, and sexuality are being operationalized in white Christian nationalism, particularly in relationship to race, even though that's not necessarily always forefronted. So I've been thinking about the scapegoating of trans people and how that relates to the racial politics of white Christian nationalism today, as well as how that scapegoating move is potentially similar to, maybe slightly different from, the move to focus on abortion in the 70s, to kind of distract from the focus on segregation. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this moment of how sex, gender, and sexuality are being used to kind of distract maybe from the racial politics of white Christian nationalism.
Well, I think if you look at the history of religious right, which I have spent far too much time doing, you see a series of subterfuges. The myth I tried to explode in bad faith is what I call the abortion myth. The fiction propagated for decades by the televangelists and everybody else, that the religious right mobilized as a political movement in the 1970s in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. And I can say without any fear of contradiction, that is absolutely false. The religious right had nothing to do with abortion. It was a defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and Jerry Falwell's Segregation Academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. Lynchburg Christian Academy, which he founded in 1967 to avoid, of course, the perils of racial integration.
I'd throw BYU in there.
And BYU? Okay, sure. Okay. I should hear from you on that. And so speaking of the Heritage Foundation, the founder of the Heritage Foundation was also the architect of the religious right, Paul Weyrich. And Weyrich was a very savvy character. I sometimes refer to him as the evil genius. He recognized, once he got Falwell and all these other people agitated and mobilized over segregation, he recognized that in order to have a broader grassroots evangelical political movement, he needed an issue other than racial segregation, defense of racial segregation. So he stumbled upon, and it is, I mean, I can get into the details for you if you wish. He stumbled upon abortion in the late 1970s as a way of mobilizing white evangelical voters. And it was a tough sell initially. He had a tough time doing it. Francis Schaeffer, and C. Everett Koop helped eventually and sold this to evangelicals as, here we go.
It's a movement thing. Yeah.
Poor Donald Trump. Sold it to evangelicals as their key issue. So that was the subterfuge back in the late 1970s. Now the subterfuge, since the Dobbs decision, which has turned out to be very unpopular with many Americans, the subterfuge now is to move toward other issues like trans folks and same-sex marriage and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's been a series of, it's kind of a game of three-card Monte in some ways.
Yeah, I think what I would add onto that really rich description is to say a couple of things. And one is going to seem a little bit out there for you also. Bear with me. Let me say the one that's not out there first. This is a subterfuge. And it's subterfuge because it's like, look over here while we're doing this. Okay. And so that's always really important. But it also is very important to understand that there are hierarchies of people you come after. Okay. And so right now it's like immigrants, right? Trump actually kind of made out a list when he came down the escalator in 2015 about, the Mexicans, the rapists, the this, the that, the other, right? And so now trans people are on top of this. This is how they're beating my university right now at $175 million because we had a trans swimmer back in 2022 following the NCAA rules that were in place at the time. Now we don't have anybody that's an athlete that we know of who's trans. And now we still get the money taken away. This was something that happened when he was not even president. Okay. So he's using this as a cudgel to pry doors open, to get what he wants. That's the first thing. But the second thing is something much more subtle. And I want to talk about that because I think it's a really important part about this. We don't talk about it enough. What is the role of womanhood in all of this? Because we don't talk about that. But I think it's really important to say there's a certain kind of influencer that's out now. I call them like mommy influencers or other people who are, showing all these things like, I'm baking in this very beautiful outfit. I can't remember her name, but she always has her face turned like this, right? And her husband, Lucky, I remember that because it's a stupid name. But anyway, and they have bunches of kids and they look great. But what they're doing is promoting certain things. I think that this one to think about here is the Dugars, who have fallen into disgrace, but presented a certain kind of what a family should look like with a lot of kids and a mother who stayed at home. And this crosses ethnic lines. Don't think this is just something that's white Christian nationalism. It's there, and this is there for a purpose. It's to show this is the ideal, and everything else does not fit this ideal. Everything else is an abomination. So it's one man, one woman. And actually, if you start to think about nationalism around the world, in terms of religious nationalisms, whether it be Christian or otherwise, most of this centers around family. And it centers around the nuclear family of one man, one woman, and how that should appear. So when we think about, places like Hungary or Moldova, Russia, all of this, they're all about how do we think about family? Think about the countries like Uganda and others that have been against homosexuality. It's about showing a certain kind of Christian belief in the one man, one woman marriage kind of thing. And I think this is what we don't talk about a lot with nationalism. I think it's really crucial to see how this is at play, not only in terms of what people try to do legally, but how they model it, how this appears in front of you, how your kids are looking at Instagram and going, well, she's really great. And look at this nice housewife stuff. I mean, that's why Barbie was so subversive. I love that movie. Yeah. But it was subversive because what she was doing was turning the whole thing on its head. And at a time when everybody wanted to have their wife and their daughter be a Barbie.
So for this next question, I'm going to be quoting from a CNN headline. If anyone is interested in the article, I'm happy to point you to it in the Q&A. But a CNN headline from last year declared that, quote, the relentless focus on white Christian nationalism in the media is spreading a racist myth that whiteness is a default setting for evangelical Christianity. Relatedly, many often wonder how to account for or understand the supposed racial and ethnic diversity, or the diverse racial and ethnic appeal of white Christian nationalism, often sensationally represented in particular figures like Enrique Tarrio, who was the former chairman of the Proud Boys and was convicted of seditious conspiracy for his role on January 6th, but was pardoned by Trump. How can we as scholars reframe the discussion of white Christian nationalism to think about political ideology as opposed to skin color and religious affiliation when it comes to white Christian nationalism? How can we highlight the important differences between and among groups who support white Christian nationalism? I think that riffs really well off what you were just saying about it has have a broad appeal across groups and across nations.
Well, I think within evangelicalism, I think the evangelicalism is now defined by a majority of Americans as being a right-wing political movement. And I think what's happened is that those evangelicals who are not comfortable with that have really refused to be identified as such any longer. So there's been a kind of defection. And, you know, I grew up evangelical, and I don't make any secret about it. And there's still a big part of me that wants still to identify with this movement, but given how it's defined politically, I simply can't do that any longer. And I'm not alone. I'm not suggesting I'm a part of a minority of a majority among evangelicals, not by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a lot of folks who simply don't want to be put in that camp any longer because of its crass politicization over the last 40 years.
You know, the way that I think about this is that it wasn't our fault that it started being synonymous with white. And the reason why is because, you know, you had plenty of Black evangelicals, right? You had Tom Skinner, you had, Bill Pennell, you had so many other people, right, that were there and, you know, rising in the 60s and the 70s. I actually think that we have to go back to the media and look at this, because the media decided that evangelical was sort of synonymous with white. And that became the appellation for everything, whether we were talking about Reagan and Bush and everybody else. You've done the presidents more than I have. Right. You know what I'm saying. Yeah. So this was easier for them to say this in polling because evangelicalism just got coded white. They just left out Latino evangelicals or Asian Americans or African Americans or whatever, you know. So back to that question, can we talk about this without race? Probably not, just because of the history of America. I mean, I think it's just really hard. I think we can. But I also think that somehow it's going to always be underneath everything that we talk about it. So that's one. I think the second thing about this terminology is that for evangelicals themselves, this is, you know, they turned away from the things that people would believe in. I'm going to think about somebody that was very big here. Why am I going to forget his name? From Colorado Springs, who, not Dobson, Ted Haggard. Ted Haggard, right? President of the National Association of Evangelicals, who got caught out because his man was watching the History Channel talking about Satan one night. Y'all don't remember these stories. I remember all of that. I just do. And, you know, and that was the moment where people, you know, evangelicals used to throw somebody out if they had a personal sin, right? And now it's like, oh, Donald Trump, 3 divorces, you know, slept with a porn star, did all this stuff. I mean, this is like, you have to look at this definition and go, what are these people saying? So I know what you mean. You know, I went to evangelical seminary. I would love to say this is part of my intellectual and spiritual heritage. It is. But on the other hand, if I tell people that, then look at me like, do you believe the same stuff that these people believe? And I have to say no. And that's a terrible thing to have to say. But it's the truth. And this is me telling a little tale out of school on myself here. But it's really sad to see this turning away from all that morality stuff. This is why, you know, I have at the bottom of my book, The Politics of Morality in America. The morality was always political. It wasn't about sin. It was about a politics. How could we use this against people to gain power? And that's what happened.
Public discussion of white Christian nationalism is frequently discussed in the context of dangers to democracy domestically in the U.S. And transnational context is often only referenced when you think about it in terms of its impact on the domestic context. However, many historians have discussed not only does white Christian nationalism rest on a bedrock of U.S. settler colonialism and imperialism, but it has a far-reaching global agenda, and its impacts on foreign policy are measurable. Indeed, you all have referenced global versions of white Christian nationalism beyond the U.S. How can thinking contextually about white Christian nationalism in these ways helps to account for its role in U.S. policy related to Palestine and Israel, both during Biden and Trump's terms? And further, how can such context provide an important framework for understanding the ongoing genocide of Palestinians, U.S. support for Israeli settler colonialism, and alliances between white Christian nationalists and far-right Israeli politicians?
Well, it's not merely Israeli. There's growing alliance between other autocrats as well that I think plays into this. But do you mind if I divert the conversation briefly? Yeah,
Please
to talk a little bit about history.
Let's do it.
And this is not new, and we've already talked about this. This is not new in American history. During the War of 1812, Timothy Dwight, who was Jonathan Edwards' grandson, thought that the reason things weren't going well for the United States in the war was because we had failed in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to acknowledge God. During the Civil War, 1864, well, before that with the Confederacy made a huge deal out of the fact that there was no acknowledgement of God in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And so they studiously wrote that into the Confederate Constitution. And a group of ministers, primarily, 1864, formed a group called the National Reform Association, the NRA, that proposed a constitutional amendment that would have rewritten the first part of the Constitution to acknowledge God as the creator, I forget the language, but Jesus as the ruler of the nations and so forth. And this got a lot of traction during the Civil War. The head of that movement was a man by the name of William Strong, who was a member of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who was later appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by U.S. Grant in 1870. This group took its petition to Abraham Lincoln and made their case before President Lincoln, who wisely temporized and said, well, we have to think carefully before we amend the Constitution, and the amendment died. They haven't given up. There have been various iterations of this throughout American history, particularly during the Cold War. There was another move to amend the Constitution in similar ways. But also Congress, you'll remember, in 1954 inserted under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, and in 1956 emblazoned "In God We Trust" on our currency and our money, as Stephen Colbert says, right where it belongs. In the early 1960s, following the Supreme Court decisions that outlawed prescribed prayer in public schools, compulsory Bible reading in public schools, there was another big push for a constitutional amendment to declare the United States was a Christian nation. Even Everett Dirksen, the distinguished senator from Illinois, minority leader, was very much behind this. He said, I'm almost evangelical about this in trying to pass this amendment. Fortunately, all those efforts failed. What we're seeing now is that they're not trying to amend the Constitution. What they're doing now is working through the legislatures in various places where there are Republican supermajorities, along with Republican governors, places like Iowa, Oklahoma, Florida, and other places, where they're simply trying to whitewash this line of separation between church and state, and simply assert that all historical evidence to the contrary, the United States is a Christian nation. And the guy behind this, we talked about Paul Weyrich, there are other villains in this narrative, but one of the ones we haven't talked about yet is David Barton. David Barton has done untold damage with his assertions that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. He even has gone so far as to say that 53, I think I get this right, 53 out of the 55 founders were evangelical Christians, which is laughable. I like to say that with the possible exception of John Witherspoon, Presbyterian minister, president of the College of New Jersey, and Benjamin Rush, a physician. None of the founders would be welcome as members in any of the churches now pushing for Christian nationalism. It just wouldn't happen. So this has a history. There's been a long history of trying to declare the United States as a Christian nation against all historical evidence to the contrary. The Treaty of Tripoli, Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, which was submitted to Congress by John Adams and ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate on June 7th, 1797. Article 11 says, as the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And it goes on beyond that. It's pretty clear. But nevertheless, you have these people who are making these assertions, and they have the ear of a lot of the politicians in Washington and elsewhere.
So let me come back to your question. Thank you. It's really just so refreshing to be on a panel with a historian. Anyway, I'm going to talk about two countries right now that this makes a lot of sense to talk about. One is Brazil. And watching what has happened with Jair Bolsonaro, if you've not been following this, has been so instructive. I said on Blue Sky a few weeks ago, it's like, dang, man, they're doing what I wanted to happen here. They've indicted him. They're going to put him on trial for what happened at Brasilia when all of his evangelicals decided to storm the capital of Brazil, right? All of the prophecies, all of the things that went into that happened because we had missionaries going down there, okay? Big Catholic country until you started having lots of evangelical missionaries and Pentecostals going down there and turn that place upside down to where now they, persecute people who practice condomblé. They try to knock over statues. They've had some of the biggest, religious scandals ever. But probably the biggest religious scandal has been Jair Bolsonaro, who tried to take over the country and tried to make sure that he would continue to be the president, unlike somebody we know here. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, what is happening in Korea right now with their president, who they have not said what's going to happen to him yet, whether he's going to be impeached or not. But guess what signs they were holding up? Stop the steal. All elderly people, 55 and older, no offense to anybody who's elderly here, I'm with you, but, they all had their waving American flags, using the same kind of things that Trump was saying here, that evangelicals were saying here about our election in 2020 and how they believe that it was stolen. So these things cross over. So now to get to your question about Israel and Palestine, everything, that is a messy, messy, messy situation. But I think the easiest way to talk about that situation is to talk about how people think about the Revelation and what they think Israel means in the book of Revelation, and how they see this land being someplace that Jesus got to put his feet on the plain of Megiddo and have everything happen and blah, 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 and all of this stuff, right? So when you ask about, how Biden saw this versus how Trump saw it, I would say to you that these kind of beliefs are operational behind all of that, because there's a big push for this. You cannot just talk about this without talking about the various organizations that are behind it, like Christians United for Israel. Can't talk about it without AIPAC. And disclaimer, I went to Israel with AIPAC. Let me tell you, it was something else. Okay, I will not talk about it on film, but it was a very interesting experience. I will tell you what it was, though. It was in 2009. They bought a whole group of African Americans. And that was because of the election of Barack Obama. And so they figured this is the time to talk. And it was a very interesting trip, and that's all I'm going to say. But you have to understand that these things are mixed together. Politics and prophecy come together in really strange ways. And we cannot talk about what is happening there without this. Trump may say he wants to do, Trump Gaza, but that's not the story. The story is, and I will quote this, and this was back, right after October 7th, which was a horrible thing. Let me just say this, very horrible. But, about a month afterwards, Netanyahu brought up and said, we're going to do this like the Amalekites. And I'm like, whoa, that should have been a signal. That should have been a signal to everybody. If you knew scripture, you knew what was about to happen. A damn Amalekites. Go look them up. Tell them who it is. But then you know there was so much language like this that was being used. And that language resonated with people who know scripture like evangelicals. So there was no coming out. It didn't matter that, Palestinians are not just Muslims, they're Christians too. There are churches that have been bombed and destroyed that are ancient churches. Nobody's talking about that. There's a reason why the Pope calls that church every night, except when he was sick. So I think we have to think a lot more, I want to say clearly and also more sophisticated thinking about what is happening, because you can't just take everything for granted what is being said to you. And I'm not saying this like you shouldn't believe it. I'm just saying you need to think about what the geopolitical situations are and how these things are connected in different kinds of ways that you can't even begin to understand unless you sit down and sit back and look at what the history has been.
I'm also glad to be on a panel with this story. Yeah. Well, I think that those examples that you all just brought up, both historical and like what's going on contemporarily, speak to the relationship between political ideology of white Christian nationalism as it's existing today and the role of settler colonialism. So with that, though, I think we are at a time when we should open up for questions with the rest of the audience in order to hear some other voices. I will say, as a reminder, we are recording. So don't start asking your question, and please be sure it is a question. Do it Jeopardy style, but please don't start asking it until a microphone comes to you. Okay. So with that, raise your hand. Oh, we already have someone. Hi.
Might stand up too so we can see you. Thank you.
Hello. So Dr. Butler, thank you for bringing up Paula White. I was curious too, because you're talking about the White House Faith Office and the weaponization of it to define Christianity in a specific way. But given Paula White is the head of it, and she's often referred to as a heretic by a lot of Christians, and she was also referred to that as a heretic in 2016 when she was named Trump's spiritual advisor. I'm curious as to what you think the particular type of Christianity will be defined as, given she's a controversial figure within Christianity itself.
First of all, I want to tell you that they're going to kiss her, anyway. Okay? Because she is in that office. And that means they have to come through her. And so by virtue of that, Trump put a marker down. And he's saying this is what it is. And if you don't like it, you're not going to get access. And trust me, the people who called her heretics, they want access. Okay. So that's number one. So this is going to be a political thing. I think the second thing is that, he's not a guy that's going to be in church. He's not going to, services. He might go on Easter. Yeah, that some stuff is happening around him. But what she does is give an opportunity for every opportunist to come through like they want to. That's why Bishop Barron is in there. That's why they've got all these different kinds of religious figures there. So I think looking at her makes you not see all the rest of the stuff that's going on around her. And what I mean by that is she can bring in people to go and pray for him. And there have been lots of different sort of televangelist types that have been there with him and everything. But I do think that this is really changing in the sense of, I think he wants to consolidate some of this stuff now. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I do think he wants to consolidate it. There's one more thing I want to say about your question. It is interesting to me, and you're going to think this doesn't rhyme, but it does kind of. It's interesting to me how he uses women in the administration. And so this recent picture of Kristi Noem in front of the prisoners, I want to encourage you to go read Jeff Charlotte's Substack, because when I saw that picture, I knew what that was, and I knew what that was appealing to. And people were horrified by it, as they should have been. But there's also this other element that's going on there that is something that is very sinister and dark, and playing with race and playing with gender and playing with a whole bunch of stuff. So I think using Paula White in that office is not just for religious reasons either.
So Project 2025 has got a lot of initiatives in it, and a lot of them are being implemented, and the government's been turned into Swiss cheese. What's the end game? What happens when everything comes to fruition?
I think you've asked an excellent question. Would you like to go first, Randy?
Well, I don't think Trump has a guiding ideology. The only ideology that I can discern is the kind of endless gratification of his own ego. So there's actually I just wrote an op-ed piece about it this afternoon. There's a piece in the Times a couple of days ago about how apparently he covets the Nobel Peace Prize.
Because Obama got it.
Because Obama got it. Exactly. And it just drives him crazy that he doesn't have the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think he's going to do the things that he thinks will shine glory on himself. But there's no ideology behind it. Now, his acolytes certainly are ideologically driven. At least many of them are. But Trump himself, I don't think. It's just too haphazard. And you see this the way the alliances shift. He has somebody he thinks is wonderful for a time, and then they say something that is maybe mildly critical, and all of a sudden they're kind of cast into outer darkness. Whereas other people like J.D. Vance, who were initially critical of him and then came around, now he's the vice president of the United States. So again, I don't think there's any guiding ideology behind. It is scary.
Yeah.
It is scary. Yeah. And for conservatives to pretend that he's an ideological conservative. I mean, I have respect for ideological conservatives. I'm not one myself, but I have respect for them. He's not one of them.
To answer your question about the Swiss cheese, remind yourself that you asked this question in 2 months. Because all of us in this room who have a pension or something are going to lose more money. There are going to be more people hungry. There are going to be more people getting ready to lose their homes. There are going to be more people who can't get a job after they lost one. There is going to be a wholesale collapse. And you'll think back to this talk and you'll go, wow, she was really bleak. And I am bleak because there's no other way to be about it. You can't continue like this. It's like the iceberg that stopped the Titanic. The Titanic sank in hours, but we're just in the middle of an iceberg right now that will take us down if something does not happen. And I hate to say it like that, but let people stop getting Social Security, let people stop getting payments, let all of these people in DC right now who are trying to unload their houses, the restaurants that are going to lose businesses. I mean, you can see it in the DC area just alone. I know people who've lost their jobs. Couple that on top of all the, natural disasters we have, fires in LA, floods in Texas today, people in Asheville and other places in North Carolina and South Carolina haven't recovered from that storm. And there's fires there today. And what is the response? We're going to get rid of FEMA right before hurricane season. These are unserious people, folks. They're serious, but they're unserious in other ways because they haven't thought about what the result is. And they have no plan. You asked a very good question. What is the plan? The plan was to dismantle. Project 2025 is about dismantling. It's not about building because they can't build it back fast enough. This place will be a husk if things don't turn around.
Who benefits from that?
Rich people.
How? Society's going to collapse.
Oh, you just buy up all your money. You put the faith of the Treasury into cryptocurrency. Do you want me to go on? I mean, there have always been robber barons, and they will always make money. Think about the 19th century. They will make money off it. They want to privatize Social Security. If they destroy everything that has been written in COBOL, they don't even understand the old computer language. I took a class in COBOL when I was in college. Okay, I could probably go over there with a couple of tweaks. I could start, oh, yeah, I remember that. But these kids are tearing it up. And they don't even know what they're building. They don't even, all of these people like a man in Seattle who just, they said was dead. And he took his bank account. He's still trying to get his money. They took all his money out of his bank account because they're like, oh, you're dead. You don't exist. So these are the practical things that are going to happen. All these programs, they've taken money from food banks. USAID, I just saw before I got here today, they are going to have that shut down by September. Do you know how many Christian organizations got money from USAID? the Catholics, the Presbyterians, everybody. You know who got money from USAID and was surprised when it closed up? Franklin Graham. What an idiot. I will say that on tape and look at the camera. What an idiot. You're supposed to be helping people across the world. And you don't know that your man, that one that you've been supporting, cut your money off from the aid that you're supposed to be giving to people around the world. They're like, we're going to send help to Thailand. We can't even help them. So I'm just telling you, the wheels have fallen off of the democracy. You are here to hear about Christian nationalism, but I'm here to tell you, Christian nationalism just tore up your country. It tore up this country. Oh. It has destroyed what America is. I don't know how to ever say this any more plainer. This is probably gonna be the last public talk I do for a while anyway. So I'm just gonna say it all tonight. I'm gonna leave it all out on the table. But yeah, it's done, folks. That's why some of us fought so hard after 1/6/21, because we did not want to see this happen. We did not want this destruction of this country to happen. And listen, I'm a Black woman. I know this country has not always extended democracy to me, but I wanted to fight for it because my forefathers and foremothers fought for it and were enslaved, and they wanted to see a better day for their descendants. And now look, he wants to wipe out the doggone museum where we got it all laid out.
After that, I don't know if I want to actually ask a question about. So my question goes back to sort of understanding Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. And as I think about the various surveys that are done from a number of different kind of survey sources, they seem to all distinguish between, to use the Whitehead and Perry stuff, between ambassadors of Christian nationalism and accommodators of Christian nationalism. And I find that to be a really interesting contrast, because one of the, I was trying to figure out the right word, evils perhaps of David Barton is that he creates this rhetoric that the accommodators could say, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get that. We should be Christians. The government needs to be more Christian. At the meantime, over here, there's Michael Flynn and there's Charlie Kirk and there's all of these organizations that are really trying to do apostolic reformation, and they're really trying to mobilize in ways that's taking advantage of those accommodators who may be more or less aware of what they're doing. And so it's like, how do we make clear those organizational forces that have distinct agendas and those people who are kind of naive believers?
Well, I come back to history. I think history is awfully important. And, people like David Barton need to be refuted. I mean, one thing I failed to mention about David Barton, he wrote this best-selling book, The Jefferson Lies, that was withdrawn from publication by his very conservative publisher, Thomas Nelson in Nashville, Tennessee, because it was so riddled with errors. I mean, he literally fabricated quotes from the founders to prove that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. So I think that's important. I think it's also important, and I'm probably naive about this, but I think it's important to point out to these people, that the First Amendment is the best friend that religion has ever had. Roger Williams is the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, is responsible for this metaphor, separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. And what we 20th century people, especially Coloradans, I suppose, miss about that metaphor is that Roger Williams was not a member of the Sierra Club. Right? He didn't share our romantic notions about wilderness. So when he's talking about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his primary concern is protecting the integrity of the faith. from too close an association with the state. Now, I think it's fair to say Jefferson believed in the separation of church and state for the opposite reasons. He wanted to protect the government from religious factionalism. But the beauty of the First Amendment for more than 200 years is that it's worked both ways, and it's worked well. And this is what I study, this is what we study. The American religious landscape, for all its recent troubles, is vibrant and salubrious precisely because of the separation of church and state. And when you try to conjoin these two, ultimately it's the health of the faith, pardon me, that will suffer. And that message needs to get out to these people, it seems to me, because I think you're right. A lot of these people are simply unwitting pawns in this larger enterprise. And the First Amendment, and what really worries me, and we haven't talked too much about it these days, is the Supreme Court, and not merely the aptly named Donald Trump versus United States decision, but First Amendment. I like to say, I wish the present court had half as much deference to the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment. And that really worries me. And it used to be that one of the bright lines in that separation between church and state was public education, the use of taxpayer money for religious schools. And now that's gone. The Espinoza decision, the Maine decision, that bright line has been traversed, and that really worries me. But again, I will return. The First Amendment is the best friend that religion's ever had, and I am truly confounded by Southern Baptists since 1979 and other religious right people actively trying to undermine the First Amendment. Why would they do that? I mean, it would destroy their faith, ultimately. I could go on, sorry.
So thank you. Back to the very beginning of trying to define what this is, these three words. You said something, Dr. Butler, that I wanted to come back to, but I've had so many questions in between now and then, I don't have it precisely. But why did all these three words go together and the history of them? And I understand it, Christian evangelicals, and then Christian nationalism, and now I understand white Christian nationalism. But I think what I heard you saying was that that it has to do partly with wanting to keep well, we can talk about white evangelicals, but you're saying there's it's not just white evangelicals.
Yeah.
But what can does it work to divide these up again, or does it? What do we get by using all of three of these together?
Yeah.
Because I thought I heard you say something to the effect that it has to do with wanting to keep it white male only, white men superior.
Yes, that white men in power. Yes, everybody else can be here. That doesn't matter. But who gets to be an authority? I mean, I think this is part of the question that she asked about. When you said at the beginning about why is DEI being struck, right? DEI being struck.
Yeah.
Because basically, it's like now what the shift is, and you have to understand what the shift is. The shift is we're not going to do diversity, equity, inclusion. We're going to say that basically you excluded white people from everything. And so now we're going to put them back into power, and we're going to put them at the place that they belong. That's what Donald Trump is about.
Okay.
This is the fundamental project of Donald Trump. Now, the other thing that I said that I think is really important for you to hear is when I said this is about the promise of whiteness. And that's a promise that made a lot of people vote for Donald Trump who don't look like Donald Trump, okay, who probably regret it right now, because now they're having to deal with the fact that thing happened, and that they thought they were part of this, because there's a cultural way in which people think that this is what it means to be an American, right? But somehow American is starting to be equated with whiteness. This is why you're having the deportation of immigrants. Because there's something about this that he's saying that the people are tainted. This follows historical ways in which people have othered other people, you know? And we can think about it in that way. But I want to finish up and say one more thing. I think if the word white hangs you up, and if the word Christian hangs you up, and the word nationalism hangs you up, it might for some people. I don't know. I would say the thing that I said last week when I talked to a group of people. I don't know that matters anymore. And that sounds like a crazy thing to say when I've been invited to talk about this. But now we're dealing with something that is the cause of the things that are happening. It's not enough to just understand this definition. What you have to do is understand what these words are doing as they are together and moving throughout your government right now. That's what you got to understand. I mean, if you leave with nothing else that I've said out here, that's the thing you remember that I said, is that this thing is what is destroying your country right now. It is taking it apart. And that's the thing to realize. And that, I think, is the thing that we were trying to get at when people were storming, because everybody forgets what it looked like that day on 1/6. I will never forget it. I watched TV that whole time thinking, man, this is going to be bad. And I watched people carrying the infant of Prague and, making a gallows, but hollering about Jesus at the same time and carrying Bibles and defecating in the Capitol and doing all this stuff.
Confederate flag.
The Confederate flag. Never, when we even had the Civil War, was there a Confederate flag in that space. Ever. But that's what they did. And so you have to look at what is happening now as the complete capture of what began on 1/6/21.
You quoted a statistic earlier, and I wonder if you could requote the statistic, because I'm going to butcher it, but it was something like 80% of white Christians voted for Trump or vote Republican or whatever the statistic was.
81%.
81%.
81% in 2016, and similar figures in 2020 and 2024.
I was curious if we know the statistics on other races that are evangelical that are pushing in that direction.
That's a good question. Not all of this has been broken out, and I wish they would, because the surveys don't ask the right questions, I feel like. And this is my frustration, because I would love to know this number for African Americans, for Latinos, for Asian Americans, okay? Especially for Latinos, because I think, we can see how the Latino vote went, but what we don't know is how that is. We know some about Catholics, and Catholics actually increased this cycle, I believe it was. They voted for Trump. I know that to be the case because I live in Pennsylvania, and that's how Trump won Pennsylvania, right? But that's a very good question. Part of the problem with some of these modeling things when they come out is that they don't go down fine enough. And now what I'm afraid of is that, I'll give you an example of my fear about the word evangelical to begin with. From 2016 to 2020, there was a way in which people who were not even church started calling themselves evangelical because they were voting for Trump. And so they weren't evangelical in the way we would normally talk about evangelical. They were evangelical. These are the people I like to call NASCAR Christians. They love Jesus. They stand up at every sports event. It's great, but they're not going to church every week. They're not paying tithes and offerings. They're not doing any of that stuff. But they are NASCAR Christians. And that makes a difference, because if you are an evangelical, let's say he was in a mainline Reformed church, or in a maybe a Pentecostal church, if we were to conflate things a little bit here, or a charismatic or non-denominational church, you could be called an evangelical too. And so, see, even those kind of ways we need to pull those things apart. But some of the posters are not asking those questions.
All right, we've hit time. I really want to thank both Dr. Butler and Dr. Balmer for a really invigorating conversation.